Hello and welcome to this ESS NatCen City University Methods Seminar. We're delighted to welcome you today. We've got a great seminar coming up being delivered by Mandy and Dorothée Behr from GESIS Leibniz Institute for Social Research Sciences, talking about cross-cultural survey pretesting in the digital age, a very topical topic, and I'm delighted to hand over to them. They're going to talk for about 45 minutes, 50 minutes, and then we'll take questions. If you've got a question for Mandy and Dorothée, please post it in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen if you're joining on the laptop, and we'll work through those questions. We'll keep an eye on them. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mandy. Thank you.
In 2017, I co-authored an article on remote and online interviewing. And at the time, we described the method as emerging. 2 years later, in 2019, books and articles that year said the same thing. And that quickly changed in 2020. The COVID-19 global pandemic has propelled all of us to fully embrace the digital age. And today, thanks to Debbie Collins and colleagues at the ESS and City University of London, we are taking advantage of the Zoom webinar platform to demonstrate some of the techniques to go beyond share screen and increase productivity, ease, and engagement for synchronous cognitive and usability testing. We will also share and discuss cross-cultural web probing as a supplement to face-to-face cognitive interviews. And our focus today is cross-cultural surveys. Dorothée will start by talking about what cross-cultural survey is, so she can set the stage.
Excellent. Many thanks, Mandy. So I would like to set the stage for you. Cross-cultural survey research, as we all know, in order to draw substantive conclusions, we need equivalent, or in a more abstract way, comparable data. In order to obtain comparable data, we can follow two paths. One path is to ensure comparability beforehand, and here pretesting comes in, and in particular this talk. But we also need to assess comparability after the fact. And this is in particular where statistical analyses come in, but also web probing, as you will hear later in this talk. Pretesting allows us in particular to identify the following issues. And here I'm quoting a very nice framework by Rory Fitzgerald and colleagues. So pretesting allows us to identify poor source question design that applies to questions in general, not just to a translated version. Pretesting allows us to identify translation problems that could be clear-cut translation errors, but they also could result from, let's say, suboptimal source question design that simply is not suitable for a translation or adaptation. And pretesting also allows us to identify cultural portability issues with items. Now, if we look at the survey landscape, we see more and more computerized surveys, not just in the national context, but also, and in particular, also in the cross-national and in the cross-cultural context. And this means that we also have more and more the interplay between technology and translation. And that means that we also have usability testing coming to the fore. And so I would now like to pass back to Mandy, who will talk about pretesting and usability testing a bit more in detail.
In a cross-cultural survey and its translations, cultural influences and languages, they just multiply compared to single country, single language surveys. But comprehension is not only about the words and sentences, but the meaning. A survey relies on interactions between the people using the language, and in our context, that's the survey respondent, how they use the language and the language itself. the role of language really is essential in survey research. Take a look at the schematic developed from the sociolinguistics paradigm. The lexical and syntactic levels are relatively easy to achieve and to evaluate. What do they refer to? Words and sentences. But on a pragmatic level, those words and sentences must convey the communication norms. And what do I mean by that? The how to say what to whom, or the survey question just wouldn't make sense and wouldn't sound natural. For example, if I asked you, how many online meetings have you had today? You understand the words, but you still need to determine what I'm looking for to give a meaningful answer. And that I asked about how many, so you want to formulate a strategy to give a number. And that's the pragmatic level. For example, you may consider, well, we are in a Zoom webinar, so maybe Mandy thinks I should count this as a meeting. So cognitive interviewing is a very helpful pretesting technique to uncover pragmatic meaning not readily found in a dictionary. Okay, let's face it. Virtual technology simply cannot replicate all face-to-face benefits. But with the right techniques, it's possible to increase productivity, ease, and engagement for both the respondent and you. Online methods require careful planning, and the advantage of doing so is that you will have significantly expanded your toolkit for pretesting. And during the pandemic, this is done out of necessity because of mode shift or mixed mode methods. And also because as a general trend, we are seeing more self-administered web surveys. Learning cognitive interviewing and usability testing takes training and practice. And today I'll just go over the main features. Cognitive interviews often involve a think aloud protocol, where we ask participants to think aloud as they answer survey items and reason through their responses. We can also probe verbally to gain more insight and identify the point of confusion. What are these probes? They can be scripted or spontaneous based on your research needs. And concurrent means probing, or simply put, probing as the respondent is answering the survey. Or you can probe afterwards, and that will be retrospective. Usability testing is a different technique, mainly focused on the interaction between the respondent and the product. So let's say in a web survey, it could be the design of the web survey buttons. So it really goes beyond just the survey questions. And for web surveys, we often combine usability testing with cognitive interviewing. As Dorothée said, cross-cultural surveys aim for comparability. Cognitive interviews can also help determine whether words, concepts, and question as a whole are understood similarly across respondents, and whether items require adaptation in different languages and cultures. So here I'm showing you some of the common probes. If you want more examples and a comprehensive review on cross-cultural survey pretesting methods, I recommend Eva Aizburua's book chapter. It's open access. I'm putting in the chats a link that you can download. People often ask me, Mandy, I already know how to share screen. So what's more to do? Today, I'm going to show you several techniques. According to Zoom support and my experience, all the features that we're showing you today can be enabled in your account at no additional cost to you. And my assumption is that you're using a laptop or desktop and you have the access to Zoom host rights. And also that you've downloaded the latest version of the Zoom app. Give me one moment to bring up the demo.
When you share screen, notice this control bar on top. The Annotate button can turn your mouse to a laser pointer. Here's what it looks like. Do you see the red dot? You can highlight content of the screen to center the respondent. To stop annotating, click mouse. The laser pointer works well when going over the consent form. You can highlight key information like voluntary nature of participation, recording. I love the new vanishing pen feature. It works great during cognitive debriefing. Let's say you verbally probe. What does this term mean to you in this question? The underline vanishes in 3 seconds and visualizes the probe. Let's see that again. 1, 2, 3. To stop annotating, click mouse. These are the mobile views of the same question in 3 languages. You can see that not only the position of the term is different for each language, they differ in their length. Spanish translation expands compared to the English, and Chinese tends to contract. In longer questions, language structure can affect scrolling, response time, and usability.
One concern I've heard quite a bit is there's no two-way mirror to set up an observation room. In a remote interview situation, observers can be clients, coworkers, note takers, and consent should be obtained from the respondent. So how do we make the observers unobstructive? I'm going to show you 2 ways.
Observers can be a distraction to the respondent, especially when their video is off. They can be hidden with this function if the respondent is using a desktop or a laptop. The observers are still online, but not directly shown on the screen. Let me show you another way to create the backroom, which I think is more smooth. Start the session with just you and the respondent. Have the respondent hide you. Turn your camera back on and go to security to uncheck start video and unmute. So when observers join, they are incognito, like this. For mobile users, I suggest doing nothing because the respondent usually can only see the active speaker and themselves. So observers are effectively hidden. For tablets, click on the 3 dots to show more options. Your respondent's actual view may be different depending on the model of the tablet they are using, but the idea is the same. Choose meeting settings. In the pop-up window, turn off Show non-video participants. Make sure you click on Done for the change to take effect. Many people are using Chromebooks these days. Go to Settings, check the option Hide non-video participants.
Think about the notifications you get every day or every hour from emails, texts, news alerts, phone calls. It just so much. To have a productive interview, we must minimize distractions. During the pre-interview setup, have the respondent turn off notifications on the device they are using. And if the respondent is using a desktop like you, it may be faster to remote control their computer. And here's how.
After the respondent shares screen, send the request from the control bar on top. Confirm request. The respondent must approve the request. The control bar tells you that you now have the control of the respondent's computer. Go to the search bar and type notifications. The respondent's desktop may look different than what's shown here, but the idea is the same. Under notifications, make sure it's turned off like this. To exit, go back to the control bar. For mobile users, choose Do Not Disturb. For iPhones, there's usually a moon shape to click on.
For those who've used artificial intelligence or machine-generated transcriptions, you know they're not perfect. Yet, they make reporting less time-consuming and more convenient. If you're using an education, enterprise, or business Zoom account, an audio transcription of the full session can be made available to you in the cloud recording. And you can edit the transcript, it's embedded as part of the video, and then you can download the transcription. If you're using a pro or free account, you have to save the transcript manually. Just remember to click save, and it's not embedded in the video. And right now, transcription is free, but only available in English. If you want real-time transcription in a non-English language, you can add third-party Zoom apps. They are easy to use, but they may require an additional fee. And issues of data security and privacy must be investigated. Now I want to show you how to operationalize the transcription feature as closed captions that you type. Some of you might be thinking, okay, why would I want to type it myself? I've got enough to do during the interview. Well, we talked about the think aloud protocol earlier. In a remote situation, thinking aloud is very helpful for the researcher. Why? Because even with shared screen, we can't always see what the respondent is doing. And in a cross-cultural situation, those contexts truly matter. So how to encourage think aloud? In the pre-interview setup, I provide a good think aloud practice. But during the interview, respondents usually need to be reminded, and it's more effective when you visualize the reminder. Give me one moment to bring up the demo to show you how.
In my experience, visualizing reminders is less distracting to the respondents than verbal, like this. To see your message, the respondent must enable the feature in their view. Have them click on the CC button for Show Subtitle. Here's what a reminder looks like in a non-English language. Many people are using Chromebooks these days. Have the respondent click on the CC button so it turns green, and your reminder message will show. How do you customize your reminder message when the respondent is completing the survey? In your view, click on the CC button. In the pop-up window, click I will type. If you have an assistant, That person can do the typing. A text box comes up. Type your message and press enter. That's it. Your message disappears from the respondent screen in about 10 seconds. Tablet and mobile users usually can see your message without having to press any buttons. But when mobile users share screen, your message will not show up. You can use the annotate feature instead. It's called text. Type your message in the text box. This is what the respondent sees on their screen. Don't forget to erase the text. See what happens if you don't erase the annotated text when the respondent is completing the survey.
I've put in chat a direct link to the complete 8 minutes of Zoom tips. And there's also a bonus tip to thank you for being with us today. Now I'm going to turn the microphone over to Dorothée to talk about asynchronous cross-cultural web probing.
Thank you very much, Mandy. First of all, I hope that you can all see my screen. I don't hear any negative reaction. So I would now would like to talk about a different kind of online pretesting that we call web probing. You may also have heard the term online probing or possibly online pretesting. Here in this talk, I'm now going to talk about web probing. What is web probing? It actually stands for the implementation of probing techniques that you know from traditional cognitive interviewing in web surveys. The goal of web probing is to assess the validity of survey items. And if we are in a cross-national context, in a cross-cultural context, the goal is to assess the comparability of survey items. And in this talk now, I would like to focus on two situations, on two case studies that show you actually the application. I'm not going into the details, basically the do's and don'ts of the implementation, like the probe screen or the size of the text box, etc. For this, I would like to draw your attention to next week's talk by my colleague Cornelia Neuert. And here on the slide, you can also find the link, because this will really be about the do's and don'ts of web probing in any context, in the national and the cross-national context, etc. For those of you who are not yet familiar with web probing, just on one slide, the facts of web probing, pros and cons, and in particular in relation to the traditional cognitive interviewing. We have large sample sizes that are possible, and that actually means that we can identify error and answer patterns and the prevalence of these patterns. We have usually a broader geographical coverage within a country and across countries, at least when you compare this to traditional cognitive interviewing. The respondents can respond anonymously, and that is, of course, important for certain topics where it is better for the respondent if nobody actually can listen to the response. If you implement web probing in a cross-national context, you have standardized probes, which ensures comparability, and this is still a positive aspect. But here now I'm also starting with the disadvantages, because standardized probes could also mean that it actually means that we have no possibility of spontaneous probing. And that actually could mean that we lose some information, because spontaneous probing is also something that is a very valuable technique in traditional cognitive interviewing. Obviously, with web probing, we can only reach the online population, and this may be not the same population as our target population, and we will have non-response, because typing in text into an open-ended text box means a burden for the respondent, and not all respondents are willing to type in text. After this very brief introduction to web probing, I will now focus on two examples to show you what is the data that we get from web probing. And I'm focusing on two projects here that I was involved in at GESIS. The first here, I call it the civil disobedience example. We used a battery from the ISSP 2004 in this case, It was a battery about people's rights in a democracy. I will briefly read out parts of this item and the intro. There are different opinions about people's rights in a democracy. On a scale of 1 to 7, where 1 is not at all important and 7 is very important, how important is it that all citizens have an adequate standard of living? And then it goes on. And the last item here of this battery is, how important is it that citizens may engage in acts of civil disobedience when they oppose government action? And now in this talk, I want to focus on this final item, and in particular on the phrase acts of civil disobedience. Here on the next slide, you see a table. These are very basic results from the real ISSP data with a selection of countries and regions. And here you see in this table that for the index, that is basically the first 6 items, all these countries and regions in the case of Germany, they are all pretty similar and close to each other. But when you look at the means for the civil disobedience items, you see on the one hand that the score is much lower than for the index, and you see 2 groups of countries. You see that something is happening with Canada, Denmark, and the United States. And we wanted to find out in our web probing study what is happening there, because the statistical data showed us that something is happening there, but we were not sure about what is happening there. And our precondition actually was that we were able to implement in our online web probing study this same pattern, and we were able to recreate this pattern that we now see here on the table. And that actually meant for us that we can very carefully use our web probing data to shed light on these suspicious ISSP data. So what did we actually do? Amongst others, we implemented a comprehension probe. And here you see the example. What ideas do you associate with the phrase civil disobedience? Please give examples. And then you see the item text repeated. You also see the text box. And I'm pretty sure that you're curious to see what kind of answers you get. And these are typical answers that you get for a comprehension probe. Often these enumerations of the comma and the next key term, the comma, the next key term. For instance, here on the right-hand side, from the US, from a respondent, you have picketing forums, boycotts, petitions, marches. Then on the left-hand side, you have a response saying protest that ends or conveys violence, or you have a response looting, anarchy, rebellion. For those of you who understand German, here on the left-hand side, on the top, we have Widerstand, zum Beispiel gegen Atomkraft, Rüstung, Steuerverweigerung, Boykotte, Besetzungen, Blockaden. And then on the right-hand side, I'm not going to read out the Spanish, but for those of you who are able to read Spanish, you see some examples from our Spanish respondents. So what did we do with these responses? We developed a coding scheme inductively based on the respondent answers. And I'm not going to detail into all of these codes, but here you see also highlighted in red 3 categories of codes that stood out in particular for Canada and the United States. We created a category called violence destruction. So you had responses like looting and rioting and violence, etc., all going to this category. We had a category about peacefulness and a category showing that respondents say, oh, it's a range from peaceful activities to destructive activities. And here with the red highlighting, you see that in particular, Canada and the United States, they are different from all the countries. For instance, for the category of violence and destructions, very low levels for all the other countries, but very high levels in Canada and the United States. And what we also did in this paper, then we ran regressions and we used these categories and codes as independent variables, and we were able to explain some of the country differences. And in particular, the code violence and destruction was a very strong predictor for the civil disobedience score. So for us, the conclusion actually was that here we have a different understanding of the items in some of the countries, which leads to item bias. And that, of course, endangers comparability. And web probing helped us to identify this issue. I would now like to move on to a second example, the social security example from my former colleague, Katharina Meitinger. What she actually did, she combined measurement invariance testing and web probing. Web probing was used in her case to explain the lack of the highest level of equivalence, the lack of scalar equivalence in her case. And I'm focusing now on the, with my example, I'm focusing on the second item of the concept constructive patriotism. And this item reads, how proud are you of country with regard to its social security system? Maybe now you have already some ideas that, oh yeah, social security system could be problematic. We know, of course, that the social security system is different in different countries. So it's not surprising that we will get different answer patterns and different distributions of the kind of benefits that these systems offer. But she found in her study a few peculiar patterns, and I would like to show you these patterns. So overall, in her study, once again, focusing on selected number of ISP countries, web probing respondents from Germany and the UK mentioned a wider variety of social security benefits than respondents from the United States, from Mexico and Spain. And in the United States, here, of course, the wording was social security system. There were a large number of respondents, 68% of US respondents referred to retirement benefits. And that could be due, this is her reasoning, that the agency that is responsible for retirement, it is called Social Security Administration. So here you see a similarity between the name of this agency and the wording in the item. It could also be that, once again, a similarity in wording. Social security taxes contribute to the retirement system. So this is also something, could be a reason why US respondents really think in a high numbers of retirement benefits. And here on the right-hand side, you see a very brief but well characteristic response from a responder from the United States, Social Security for seniors. In Spain, we had 72% of respondents referring to health-related benefits. For those of you who speak Spanish, here's a very long response from a Spanish respondent. And it seemed to be that quite a number of respondents thought that the translation Sistema de Seguridad Social is maybe equivalent to the Spanish healthcare system. And now the kind of nicest example, of course, not in terms like as a result for the data quality, but is a kind of very nice example of what is happening against the backdrop of the cultural situation. We once again had the Spanish translation from Mexico, Sistema de Seguridad Social, and Katharina Meitinger found out that 39% of respondents thought of the security situation on the streets. Here, for instance, on the left-hand side, you see one of these answers. And if you think about what we sometimes hear in the media about kidnapping and all of the violence happening, it's not surprising that an item without context could be understood in such a way. And this is, of course, something on the face level. It looks good, the translation, but this is cultural background coming in. And that actually means we have a cultural problem here. And of course, these data are not comparable anymore to all the other data and to the intended meaning. These were two examples in detail. Two other examples, just briefly to show you what kind of other items can be tested or what kind of other research questions can be addressed. For instance, we also studied measures to study xenophobia, and we were interested in particular in the meaning of immigrants. For instance, in items like immigrants are generally good for the country's economy. I think the ESS has also a lot of these items. For instance, here we probed which type of immigrants were you thinking of when you answered the question. Or my colleague Michael Brown and myself, we are currently conducted split ballot experiments, and we included web probing, split ballot experiments with different translation versions. And now we want to find out with web probing, so what do the different translation versions actually mean to the respondents? For instance, the item, to what extent do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Countries should limit immigration in order to protect our national way of life. And we had in the German language, in this particular case study, 2 translations of national way of life. One was Kultur, which is close to, well, basically culture, and one was Lebensweise, way of living, on the like surface level, pretty similar to way of life. And we wanted to find out, so what is happening with these different terms? Do they trigger different associations, or basically is the understanding the same? So after these examples that hopefully can show you the potential of web probing, we would like to draw your attention to another aspect that is very closely linked to web probing, but also to cross-cultural cognitive interviewing, the traditional cognitive interviewing. So how to deal with the multilingual answers that you get. For instance, in our case, we had at the minimum 100 answers from respondents in the different countries or cultures in different languages. And when we developed coding schemes, basically this is, we developed them inductively based on the respondent answers. And for this, it is important that you take into account a sample of answers from all the countries and cultures, not just from one of or 2 of the countries and cultures, because you will find very peculiar country-specific answer patterns. You will find country-specific categories. And if you focus just on one country when you develop a coding scheme, this will introduce bias into the results. And of course, this is something that we want to avoid, to introduce bias at this stage, because then we cannot really measure comparability or assess comparability anymore. Then also one needs to find an answer to the question how to analyze the answers in the different languages. So you can, of course, code the probe answers in the original language. If you have the research team, if you have experts in the different language and in the different languages, here it is important that the coders are familiar with the source language and the culture. And here I'm referring to a very nice example from my colleague Dorothée, who looked in a recent paper, looked into the translation of open-ended answers into the coding. And she found, for instance, there was the case study of a probe questioning the understanding of left and right. So in the political context, respondents, they position themselves on the left or on the right, and then they were probed, what do they understand by left, what do they understand by right? And then we had all the probe answers, and we had a student assistant, or they, in their research study, they had a student assistant from the United States who coded responses from Canada. And then there a lot of times the word state appeared. From an American perspective, state is something like the states, the different states, Texas, etc. in the United States. But from a Canadian perspective, it's the top level, the national, the country level. And there was a misunderstanding then based like how this was coded, and an error was introduced into the coding because culture was not taken into account. When the probe answers are or need to be translated so that the coding takes place based on the translations, it is very important to brief and train translators on the particularities of open-ended answers and what is expected of them. For instance, not to change the respondent's voice, or possibly to provide additional cultural background information, because this is open-ended answers that is not a text type that translators usually work with. So it's important to convey, to tell them what is the place of these open-ended answers in research, how they will be used, so that the translators can really be a good colleague and collaborator in this whole endeavor. And also here, when they translate code probe answers, it's important that the translators are familiar with the source language and the culture. And one word about coding probe answers in translated versions. What we also found out in one of our studies, that you also have to be wary of potential translation errors. So if you find peculiar answer patterns that simply seem to be weird, it certainly makes sense to question the translation. For instance, on the example with the term immigrants, what kind of immigrants did you think of when answering the question? We had Danish answers. They gave us the word Mellemøsten. I have no idea how to pronounce that correctly in Danish, but anyway, we got the German translation into Mittlerer Osten. And this is not a term in German that really is used in the discourse. And so we asked again, are you sure that this is Mittlerer Osten? And we got back the answer, oh no, there was a mistranslation. It is Nahe Osten, Middle East. And that was important because that meant for us a different code. So be careful when you use translations of open-ended answers. But I can conclude with a very positive research study that my colleagues, Evi Scholz and colleagues just recently finished. They compared coding based on translated probe answers and coding based on like the original language probe answers, and coding of translated answers can be implemented successfully. So even though there were some translation mistakes, it didn't like the overall result was pretty similar to the coding based on the original answers. So that was a very positive and encouraging results, I would say. And with this, I would like to come to the wrap-up and outlook. You have seen here that digital methods, whether it's the online cognitive interview via a platform or web probing, that they successfully enlarge the toolkit of social researchers. We have benefits and drawbacks compared to traditional face-to-face synchronous settings, and these should be taken into account. These online methods are definitely a supplement to traditional methods, so it's not about a replacement. It is, you have a larger toolkit, and using digital resources should not be understood as, oh, quick and dirty methods. Now we can do everything within the shortest span of time. They require careful methodological planning to ensure the collection of sound data and to ensure that we really get the heart of comparability and equivalence. And with this, I would like to conclude and come to the end. And we are happy to hear your questions, thoughts, feedback, and I'm passing on to Debbie.
Thank you very much, Dorothée, and Mandy, for a really fascinating presentation. I can see a couple of questions in the chat. Please do post your questions there. So there's a first question, which I think is probably for you, Dorothée, which is from Betical. Sorry if I've mispronounced your name. I'm not very good with pronunciation. Can you please define web probing in more detail? So I think this is a question about how does web probing differ from cognitive interviewing?
Yeah. So you take the biggest similarity is that you take the probes that you use in the probing paradigm and that you implement them in the web environment. So for instance, in comprehension probe on the meaning of a term, or a category selection probe, why a respondent selected a particular answer. And you implement them in the web environment, and you ask respondents to type in text, and you hope essentially to get the same type of text. You hope to learn about the cognitive processes that go in respondents' minds. So this is the similarity to traditional cognitive interviewing, but of course the difference is that the respondents, it's not just that they can speak and the interviewer listens, they really have to type in text into a text box. And here then we have not everyone is willing to do that, because it is, as we said before, it is a burden. And of course, what you don't have is the flexibility. I know from, and Mandy can say more about this, flexible and spontaneous probing can be very valuable, because you may see problems that you haven't anticipated. And this is something that you cannot, of course, anticipate in a web probing study, because you have to program everything in advance. You have to think of what I am of my goals. So what kind of probes should I ask? Where should I ask these probes? But for this, if I may once again, draw your attention to next week's talk. Cornelia Neuert will really go into the details because the design of a probing study, how to position and how to select probes, how to work probes, that is very important for web probing studies, and she will cover this as well.
Yeah, so just to add to what you've said, the key difference is that in web probing, there is no interviewer involved in doing the probing, whereas in a cognitive interview, there is. So in effect, your web probes are like open questions that you have written and get programmed into the web instrument that you're testing. That's what you're saying, I think, isn't it, Dorothée? Yeah. Great. Thank you. Mandy, did you want to add anything?
I think Dorothée said it very well.
Great. Thank you. There's another question from Annie Petit. Are there any scenarios where you would avoid online interviews? So I'm not sure whether here, Annie, you're thinking of online live kind of cognitive interviews using video conferencing, or whether you're thinking about web-based probing. Let's assume for the minute that it's about live interviewing, cognitive interviewing using video conferencing software like Zoom. Mandy, I think that's a question for you.
Sounds good. Like you said, Debbie, you could be doing online, could be synchronous or asynchronous, such as web probing. When do we avoid online interviews? That was the question. Number one, if we promise respondent the interview would take a certain amount of time, and then technology comes into play and we are delayed significantly. That's happened actually quite a bit. And in that case, then online interview is not going to be productive. And another reason why online will be avoided is if they are truly more sensitive information that's being collected. And also just thinking about the interactions, we really need to make sure that we can minimize distractions. It also depends on where the respondent is. I think privacy, data security are all very practical concerns. But during the pandemic, it's out of necessity that we had to go online. And as we've demonstrated that it is possible to increase productivity and even ease and engagement, but we simply cannot replicate all of the face-to-face benefits.
Great, thank you. Dorothée, do you have anything to add?
I would like to add for web probing, when to avoid that. So web probing is, you have to identify the items in advance where you want to add your probes. If you're not yet sure where problems might occur, or are interested in the entire instruments and that you hope for also spontaneous reactions from the respondents, then it's better to go to use the traditional cognitive interviewing method. This is one instance. If you're really interested in in-depth insights, several probes, for instance, for one item, you can try that online, and we've experimented with that as well, but you cannot ask that many probes online, because then you may lose respondents. Debbie, as you said before, we don't have an interviewer. An interviewer plays a very crucial role when it comes to motivating the respondents. We don't have that in the online interview. Even though also colleagues tested with how many probes you can ask online, there will be a limit. And then, of course, it's better to have an interviewer, to have this motivating energy by an interviewer.
Great, thank you. So there's a comment here from Ali Sue. Mandy, I have found that one of the biggest drawbacks in virtual cognitive interviews is to keep the respondent focused and not distracted by other things we cannot see that are happening at their end. Do you have any suggestions on how to keep the respondent focused?
Distractions are an issue whether you're online or offline. And one way that I found that's helpful to minimize distractions is turn off all of the notifications on the respondent's device. And the demo today, we showed a couple ways you can remote control or instruct the respondent to go through that step. That's number one. Number two is you want respondents to think aloud. And when you try to remind them during the interview, it's a really major distraction. And in the demo, we suggested that you can visualize reminders because that sensory experience, in fact, enhances engagement. And number three, to minimize distractions, is distraction on your end. Sometimes as the interviewer, we have emails, we have chat messages, maybe from the note taker. And then when the respondent notices that we are not paying attention, then it's more likely that they are not. I've also had respondents who are on the device and then they were checking emails. And so it's good to set up the ground rules ahead of time. I've also found that giving people instructions ahead of time, like you should test this, test that, set this up. Very few people are industrious enough to do it ahead of time. So really have a good practice, pre-interview practice, and a session, pre-interview session to set up these ground rules are very worthwhile of the time and investment.
Great, thank you. There's a question here from Patty Gorman. Dorothée, for multilingual web probing studies, have you been able to experiment with coding responses before versus after translation?
So this is the paper by my colleague Efi Scholz that I referred to before. So they, once again, it was about the probe. What do respondents understand by left and right in the political context? And they really looked at the coding when it was done on the original answers and the coding when it was done on the translated answers. And that was really similar, the results. So their recommendation was really you can continue with translation if you need to translate, but of course you have to train and brief translators. So you have to approach translation carefully in order to have useful translated answer. I didn't show that. Actually, we have a slide at the end, and there we have a lot of references. And there you have as well this paper, Efi Scholz, Britta, Dora, Konitzel. Just I think it got published in December 2021.
Great, thank you. And the link to where you will find the slides is in the chat now, but you'll also get an email after this seminar with a link to the recording as well of the of today's session. There's a question here from Lisa Lynn Freeman. Great presentation. Thanks for putting this together. Question on the Zoom desktop changes demo earlier. Do you go back to the respondents and put their settings back after the session?
I think it would be friendly for you to do that because some of the features are remembered the next time. So if there is time, I think it's helpful so that they go back to the original settings.
Great, thank you. And a question from Deirdre Geeson. Do you have experience with unmoderated remote cognitive interviewing where you would get video and audio as well? This may be a bit in between web probing and live remote cognitive interview. The benefit may be that respondents can talk and do not need to type.
I have not done unmoderated remote interviewing because I find context very important. And without the observation, with just seeing a pre-recorded video, I feel that there's missed opportunities to probe. And that's really the biggest benefit of having an interviewer present is probing. Although for web probing, I think Dorothée can address this, you could record, right, Dorothée, rather than typed responses.
Yes, we haven't done this. I know that I think they run experiments in the Dutch LIS panel, which is a representative online panel. Katharina Meiting and Matthias Schonlau, they were experimenting with probes and then recordings. But I haven't seen any publications yet. And I also know that Jan Karem Höhne, that they had, I think not probes, but usual open-ended questions that got recorded and then possibly also immediately transcribed. I know that there is something going on there. So if you're really interested in that, so maybe check out papers, the recent papers by Jan Karem Höhne, and also maybe soon there will be some publications by Katharina Meiting and Matthias Schonlau on this.
Great, thank you. And there's a question from Mitch. Any thoughts on how to compare across cultures with cultural survey response tendencies? For example, some populations are more likely to choose the extreme responses like strongly agree, disagree for a survey, and other populations are more likely to choose the middle responses.
Can I ask again?
Do you want me to read it again?
The first question at the beginning?
So the first bit is any thoughts on how to compare across cultures with cultural survey response tendencies?
Okay. I mean, if you want to learn about these tendencies, because I think that is crucial as well to really identify these tendencies and to delineate that from real answers, substantive answers. You may want to try to ask respondents why they chose a certain category and not another one. Maybe you will find some patterns that really are a sign of response tendencies. I'm not sure. I have never. We haven't probed in that direction, but there is certainly a lot of potential to learn more about response tendencies using probing questions, also online probing questions.
I was struck that your example where you were looking at understanding a civil disobedience, kind of you could possibly take a similar approach to what you did there, where you were unpacking what people thought about that term to see whether then their interpretation of it led them to respond in a particular way to that item. That was very interesting.
I just want to add that that's such an excellent question. And if we can solve that, that would be such a wonderful experiment that we can conduct. Yeah. And I think we have to keep in mind that this response pattern is not necessarily just about one thing. Culture is involved, if language is involved, and sometimes it's really an interaction, and the question order actually matters quite a bit. And there's actually a line of literature on this. I see the person asking is Michelle Chen. Michelle, get in touch with me. I will send you some literature.
Great, thank you. One last question from Brita. Dora, thank you for an interesting talk. Do you have experience of whether different cultures have different answer behaviours on probes? And if so, do you recommend taking that into consideration in order to receive the same level of richness of answers cross-culturally?
Yes, avoid probes that elicit just yes or no. My experience has been mostly with Asian and Hispanic respondents. If the probes are not designed to elicit more in-depth information, then you're getting a lot of yeses, and that's not really very helpful information. So definitely want to design probes in a very thoughtful manner.
And for web probing answers, my colleague Katharina Meitinger, and I was involved somewhere as well, they looked at quality indicators, and they found that quality indicators such as non-response and length of text, etc., that they operate differently depending on country or language. So it's not that you should use one quality indicator and that it works the same across all languages. And you will find also in web probing that some respondents from some cultures, they possibly like writing more. It's their style. It's than from other countries. So you will see these effects. I have to admit that we haven't, up to now in our research, we didn't take into account these effects when we did our substantive analyses. But it's definitely something that you could investigate further in the future.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for a really excellent presentation. I can see lots of thank yous and effusive comments in the chat. Thanks very much again, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you next week for part 2 of this session. Thanks very much.